The streets of Charleston woke slowly, as if stirred from a long, humid dream. Cobblestones, still slick from dawn's sea mist, glistened under the pale sky, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt water, wood smoke, and boiled linen. On the corner of East Bay, before merchants opened their shutters and carriages began their daily circuit, Hannah moved silently with a basket balanced against her hip. To any passerby, she was a housemaid going about her chores, washing, delivering, collecting. Nothing more. What they didn't see was the map folded invisibly into the fabric of her movements. Every step Hannah took through Charleston's narrow lanes had been rehearsed and refined over years. Her routes connected the city's laundry yards, kitchens, stables, and servant entrances like threads in an invisible quilt. Each house she visited, each stop she made, seemed ordinary enough. A mistress's linens to collect, a cook's aprons to return, a stable hand's blankets to wash. But between these errands lay subtle patterns, turns down back alleys, pauses at specific gates, baskets placed momentarily on worn brick steps that carried meaning to those who knew how to read them. The laundry was her cover, the streets her code. The city itself lent her its disguise. Charleston's tightly knit neighborhoods were threaded with alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass. Behind the facades of grand townhouses, a network of outbuildings and narrow service corridors formed an entire second landscape, a servant's landscape, where maids, cooks, porters, and enslaved laborers moved like quiet currents beneath the surface of polite society. Hannah had learned every turn, every loose board in every fence, every shortcut between kitchen yard and street, until the layout lived in her mind as clearly as scripture. Each morning before sunrise, she would begin at the washing yard where piles of soiled linens waited. She worked with practiced speed, scrubbing shirts, petticoats, tablecloths, and sheets in scalding water, her hands reddened and strong. By the time the city stirred awake, she would have cleaned enough laundry to justify her movements. Then came the deliveries, an errand girl to some, but to others, a signal moving through the city. The signals were simple, almost invisible. A folded sheet tucked at the top of a basket indicated safe passage toward the harbor. A rolled apron hinted at a patrol's shifting schedule. A lace collar placed upside down on a stoop meant danger on the usual path. These codes were shared only among a small, trusted circle fugitive slaves seeking a way north, free black residents who offered shelter or forged papers, and a few sympathetic dock workers who looked the other way when boats left at night. Hannah had not invented these signs, but she had perfected their rhythm. Over time, her routes formed a living map, from the laundry yard near the market, through St. Philip's Alley, past the cooper's shop where crates were left conveniently unguarded, to the wharves where ships waited under British flags and the promise of elsewhere. Each stop could look like a simple delivery. Each basket could hold nothing more than folded linen. But sometimes, between those layers, slipped thin packets of dried food, forged passes pressed between handkerchiefs, or directions written in invisible lemon ink. She rarely spoke of her work. Words were dangerous, and ears in Charleston were sharp. Instead, she relied on patterns repetition that blended into the city's daily rhythm. If a stranger followed her for a day, they might see nothing at all, but for those watching carefully, the route itself told a story, a path that began in servitude but pointed toward freedom. Hannah's calm exterior masked the precision of her calculations. She knew exactly how long it took her to walk from the washing yard to the big house on Meeting Street, how many minutes she could afford to linger at the Coopers before questions arose, and when the morning patrols would turn down Broad Street. Her sense of timing was honed by necessity. One misstep could unravel years of quiet work. She remembered, with a clarity that made her jaw tighten, the first time she had carried more than laundry. It had been a folded letter sealed in wax, pressed into her hand by a man whose eyes never quite met hers. "Just deliver this to the baker," he had whispered, glancing over his shoulder. She had tucked it between tablecloths, heart pounding so loudly she feared the guards on the corner could hear. But when nothing happened, when she reached the bakery, made the delivery, and walked away unseen, something shifted inside her. She realized how invisible she could be if she remained careful. The city's gaze passed over her like she was part of the cobblestones. Invisibility became her greatest strength. Others began to notice her reliability, not openly, but through small gestures. A folded scrap left at her usual bench, a whispered name at the well, an unfamiliar face waiting by a gate who vanished when she nodded. Over the years, the network coalesced around her movements, each person playing a small role that, when woven together, created something powerful. Hannah wasn't a leader in the way men in taverns gave speeches or planned uprisings. Her power came from silence, from knowing when to look down, when to glance up, and when to keep walking. The city's white residents barely saw her. To them, she was a laundress anonymous, replaceable, harmless. They noticed the clean linens returned on time, the quiet demeanor, the bowed head. They did not notice the patterns in her roots. They did not see the way she occasionally shifted baskets between hands at specific intersections, or the way she used church bells to gauge the movements of patrols. Their blindness was her shield. Still, every morning carried a risk. Patrols roamed unpredictably. Bounty hunters came and went. A single search of her basket could end everything, but the necessity was greater than the fear. There were people depending on her. Somewhere beyond Charleston's maze of streets lay the road north, and somewhere along that road were families who needed a silent guide at the city's edge. The rhythm of her roots had become so ingrained that she sometimes felt the city moving with her. The laundry yard's whistle marked the beginning. The church bell on St. Michael's signaled the midpoint, and the return to the washing yard closed the loop. Each loop tightened the invisible net beneath Charleston's elegant veneer. This morning was no different, at least, not yet. Hannah adjusted the basket on her hip, stepped onto a narrow side street, and let the city's sounds fold around her. The creak of shutters, the distant cry of gulls, the slap of water against pilings. In the quiet between those sounds, she traced her path forward, a path no mapmaker had ever drawn. The roots were her world, the baskets were her voice, and in the gaps between the city's glances, Hannah wrote a story no one was supposed to read. The laundry alone was not enough. To keep the roots alive, Hannah needed eyes, ears, and hands spread across Charleston's hidden layers, people who would not betray her, even under the weight of threats or the promise of reward. Over the years, a loose but quietly effective network had grown beneath the folds of linen she carried, formed of unlikely allies who understood the value of silence. It began with the traders. The city's markets, always buzzing with hawkers and barterers, were more than places of commerce. Beneath the chatter of fishmongers and the rhythmic calls of fruit sellers, deals were struck that had nothing to do with oysters or apples. Some traders were free blacks who had earned enough to rent stalls. Others were poor immigrants whose distrust of slave catchers ran deeper than any loyalty to the patrols. They watched the comings and goings, learned which officers were lazy, which preferred the shade of a tavern over proper rounds, which carriage owners let their drivers loiter too long at alley entrances. Their information was precise and quietly exchanged. Hannah didn't speak much to them in public. Words were dangerous currency. Instead, she would place a folded piece of linen on the edge of a fish stall, or adjust her basket strap twice while passing by a spice merchant. These small gestures were understood among those who shared the unspoken code. In return, a trader might leave a folded paper beneath a crate, or nod imperceptibly toward a quiet alley tiny signs that carried the weight of survival. Then there were the porters and dock workers. The wharves along Charleston harbor were alive with ships arriving and departing, sails furled and unfurled, ropes coiling like serpents across wooden planks. Among the crews were men who had seen the northern ports, who had touched cities where slavery's reach was weaker, and who carried stories like contraband in their memories. A few were willing to help not out of charity, but out of understanding. They had watched fugitives stumble onto docks in the dead of night, faces pale with fear, clothes soaked from the marshes, eyes burning with desperation. They knew what it meant to run. Hannah's contact among them was a man called Peter, a wiry dockhand with a sharp jaw and hands permanently smelling of tar. He had once been property himself, but had bought his freedom years earlier by working double shifts until he could hand his owner enough coin to make himself disappear from the ledger. He never raised his voice, never asked questions, but when Hannah arrived with a bundle that felt heavier than usual, he would simply glance at the tide and murmur, "Tonight's good for sailing," before going back to coiling ropes. Forged passes, food, and letters moved through these channels like hidden currents. Hannah's baskets were only the delivery vessels. The real strength of the operation lay in the trust between people who could never meet openly. A baker might supply wrapped loaves with dried meat hidden inside. A carpenter could craft a false-bottom trunk destined for a ship's hold. A seamstress would stitch star patterns into a lining that could guide someone north at night. None of these actions alone meant much, but together they formed a lifeline. Among her closest confidants was Lottie, a free black seamstress whose small shop faced a busy street. During the day she sewed dresses for the city's wealthy families, her windows filled with lace and fine muslin. But after hours, she worked by candlelight on quilts and garments that were meant for something far greater. She had a gift for embroidery so delicate that it could hold secrets. A line of stitches slightly thicker than the rest marked a turn in a trail. A pattern of stars stitched into a hem told a traveler when to leave the road and head into the woods. Hannah often delivered and collected these items as if they were nothing more than newly hemmed skirts. Their conversations were rare and always brief. One afternoon, as Hannah pretended to examine a spool of thread, Lottie murmured, "The patrol's got new eyes near the harbor. Don't linger." Hannah responded only with a slight tilt of her basket. That was enough. Words were unnecessary when both understood the stakes. The network reached even into the kitchens of the wealthy. Housecooks, women who moved between scullery and dining room without being acknowledged, knew the rhythms of their masters' households better than anyone. They overheard guests discussing shipping schedules, political gossip, and the movement of slave catchers disguised as merchants. When Hannah arrived to deliver clean linens, a cook might leave a spoon angled a certain way on the counter or hang a damp towel on a specific peg. Each sign carried information: a change in guard rotation, an unexpected arrival, a dangerous guest. Hannah understood that her survival depended not only on her skill, but on her ability to make others feel safe around her. Trust was fragile in a world where betrayal could mean lashes, branding, or the auction block. She never demanded help. She simply made it possible for others to offer it without being seen. It wasn't a formal organization, no oaths, no written plans, no leaders. It was a living, breathing thing that grew through shared risk. Each person held only a fragment of the whole, enough to act, but not enough to endanger everyone else if caught. Hannah's role was to carry the fragments from place to place, weaving them together through her quiet roots. At night, when the city hushed, and the only sounds were crickets and the distant crash of waves against the battery, she sometimes sat in the laundry yard after everyone had gone. The stars above Charleston were bright, even in summer's heavy air. She would think about the families who had vanished northward, those who had walked through alleys under her silent watch, and later found themselves on free soil. She never saw their arrival. She only heard whispers months later, a letter delivered by someone else, a name mentioned with relief, a story told in secret at a harbor tavern. That was enough. Each whisper was proof that her work mattered, but with each success, the danger deepened. Patrols grew suspicious when too many fugitives slipped through the city. Bounty hunters arrived with sharper questions. Some white families began instructing their servants to watch each other. Hannah's roots were still intact, but she could feel the net tightening, not because anyone had caught her, but because the city itself was growing uneasy. Invisible patterns make the powerful nervous once they sense they exist. She noticed it first in the way a patrolman lingered too long at a corner she passed daily, then in the sudden search of baskets near the market square, where a girl she'd trained narrowly escaped discovery. Information began to flow slower. Signals took longer to reach her. The traders' nods were shorter, more guarded. Dock workers checked over their shoulders before speaking. Something was shifting. Hannah adapted. She shortened some routes, lengthened others. She began rotating the signals so that no pattern remained predictable for long. Her mind worked like a chess player's, always 3 moves ahead, anticipating not just what the patrols would do next, but what they would suspect she might do. Through it all, she kept her demeanor unchanged, quiet, polite, invisible. Her strength lay in the fact that no one with power thought to look closely at the laundress passing by. The network depended on that oversight. Every folded sheet, every adjusted basket strap, every glance toward a wharf became part of a system greater than any one person. Hannah was its heartbeat, steady and unassuming, pulsing beneath Charleston's polished surface. And yet, beneath that steady rhythm, something darker was approaching, an unplanned variable stitched not into linen, but into a handkerchief that would change everything. The handkerchief arrived on a cloudless afternoon, folded neatly among a pile of linens from a house that stood near the corner of Meeting and Trad Streets. The mistress of the house, Mrs. Alcott, was known throughout Charleston for her fastidiousness. Her monogram, a looping, elaborate A entwined with ivy, appeared on everything from her napkins to her husband's pocket squares. Hannah had collected and returned her laundry for years without incident. She knew the household's rhythm well. Servants who lingered too long by the fountain, a coachman who dozed behind the carriage house, and a mistress who rarely ventured into the backyard. Nothing about that day should have been different. Yet as Hannah dipped her hands into the pile, she felt the difference immediately. The handkerchief was heavier than the others, not by much, just enough for someone who'd spent years carrying baskets to notice. She turned it over casually as though inspecting a stain. The monogram was new, the stitching slightly fresher than usual. Along the edge, her fingertips detected a faint ridge. Inside that ridge, she discovered a piece of paper folded so thin it could have passed unnoticed by anyone less careful. She glanced around the yard. No one paid her any mind. Other women scrubbed shirts at the tubs. A boy hauled buckets from the pump. With practiced ease, she slid the handkerchief beneath another folded cloth and moved on, her heartbeat steady. She would not open it here. Too risky. Later that evening, beneath the dim light of a single lantern in the washing yard, she unfolded the handkerchief. The paper inside was creased with precision. On it was a name one she recognized at once. It belonged to a free black carpenter known for his quiet generosity, a man who sometimes left small scraps of wood with carved arrows along alleyways to guide runaways toward safer paths. He was cautious, always careful to avoid drawing attention. And yet, here was his name, written in an elegant hand, as if copied from a ledger. Beneath the name was a date, and beneath the date, a single line. Meeting arranged. Confirm delivery. Hannah stared at the words. This wasn't part of the usual network signals. It was too direct, too exposed. It felt like bait. Her fingers tightened around the paper. There were 2 possibilities, both dangerous. Either someone within the network had grown careless and sent information in a way that could be intercepted, or someone had deliberately inserted this into her basket to flush out participants. Either way, the paper could not remain where it was. She burned it quickly over the lantern, watching the flames consume the elegant handwriting until nothing remained but curled ash. But the handkerchief itself was the real threat. Mrs. Alcott's monogram was known among Charleston's elite. If patrols were looking for signs of escape networks, they would recognize the crest, and if they traced it back to the carpenter whose name had been written within, questions would follow. Questions led to searches. Searches led to baskets. The following morning, Hannah returned the cleaned linens to Mrs. Alcott's household with her usual composure. She moved through the service gate, exchanged polite nods with the cook, and placed the folded sheets on the back steps. She left the monogrammed handkerchief neatly on top, exactly where it should be. To alter its placement would be to invite suspicion, but as she walked away, she noticed something chilling. 2 patrolmen stood across the street, leaning casually against a post. They were not there yesterday. Their uniforms were clean, their posture too deliberate. One of them watched her with the indifference of someone who didn't care who saw him looking. The other's gaze moved between her basket and the house as if measuring distance. Her roots had never been truly invisible, but this was the first time she felt their gaze directly on her back. Over the next few days, the change grew more pronounced. Patrols appeared in places they had rarely bothered with before, street corners near the cooper's shop, the lane by the seamstress's window, the market where she received signals. It was subtle enough not to alarm the city's white residents, but for Hannah, it was unmistakable. Someone had shifted attention toward her path. One afternoon, she heard 2 traders whispering behind the fish stall. "They've got a list," one muttered. "Names, houses, routes. Whose list?" "They say the patrol found it in a servant's quarters. A letter, with a monogram." Hannah kept her face neutral, hands folded against the edge of her basket, but her stomach twisted. A list meant more than suspicion. A list meant they were no longer searching blindly. They were hunting. She shortened her routes again, cutting through tighter alleyways, using less obvious signals. But the feeling of eyes followed her like a shadow. A patrolman questioned her near the docks one morning, pretending casual curiosity. "You walk these streets a lot," he said, his drawl slow. "What's in the basket?" "Laundry, sir," she answered calmly, tilting the basket to reveal the folded linens. He leaned in, perhaps expecting to find something more sinister, but saw only cloth. "You work for the Alcotts?" "Yes, sir." "And others?" "Busy woman." "Yes, sir." He let her pass, but not before his eyes narrowed in a way that told her he'd remember her face. Inside the network, the discovery sent ripples. Lottie stopped using the star-stitched hem signals for a while. Dock workers whispered about increased inspections on outgoing ships. A baker removed the false bottom from a crate and swore off hiding anything until the heat died down. Trust didn't vanish, but it pulled back like water before a storm. Hannah understood the danger better than anyone. The network wasn't a building. It was a web of fragile threads. When one thread frayed, the entire structure trembled. She spent long evenings sitting by the tubs, thinking through contingencies, reshaping routes in her mind. If the patrols followed her basket too closely, she would have to break the pattern entirely and rebuild from scratch. The monogrammed handkerchief had done its work. Whether by design or mistake, it had thrown light on a path that had survived precisely because it was hidden. Now the city's gaze was turning toward it, slow and methodical, and somewhere behind that gaze, someone was keeping count. As the autumn air began to cool, Hannah's footsteps grew lighter, her movements more deliberate. Every turn, every pause carried the weight of potential exposure. The handkerchief was back in Mrs. Alcott's linen drawer, harmless to anyone unaware. But Hannah knew better. Its stitches had pulled on something deep within Charleston's quiet resistance, a thread that, once tugged, could unravel years of careful work. She pressed forward anyway, her face calm, her basket steady. There was no turning back, only forward, through the tightening streets, toward a future she couldn't yet see. Night crept over Charleston with a heavy stillness, broken only by the distant rattle of carriage wheels and the low hum of crickets. Patrols had grown sharper since the discovery of the handkerchief. Lanterns now swung from more corners, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Footsteps echoed longer, lingered louder. Hannah felt the city itself shifting. What had once been her shield was becoming a maze with fewer exits. She adjusted her routes accordingly. Where once she walked openly through alleys at dawn, she now favored twilight, and the hour just before the bells struck midnight. In those quiet stretches, the city's wealthy slept behind locked shutters, and the patrols, though watchful, often grew drowsy. But this was no longer routine. Each night became a careful choreography of sound and silence. The first signal came from the market. Lottie had sewn a new hem into a plain apron, a short, uneven line of stitches along the bottom edge. Hannah recognized it instantly. It meant new patrol routes. Avoid Meeting Street. She didn't linger. She tucked the apron under folded sheets and continued. Her second signal came at the cooper's shop. A single barrel sat outside, its lid slightly askew, and turned east instead of west. That meant search expected divert south. The cooper never spoke to her directly, but his barrels had become as reliable as any messenger. She adjusted course, ducking through a narrow passage that smelled of molasses and damp wood. Her third signal that night was the most unsettling. As she passed the corner near the docks, a dockhand she didn't recognize tilted his cap twice and turned away quickly. That gesture usually meant watchers nearby. She slowed her steps, allowing her breathing to match the soft rhythm of the night. 2 patrolmen emerged from a side street moments later, their lanterns cutting across the alley. One of them paused, looking in her direction. Hannah lowered her gaze, shifted the basket on her hip, and kept walking as if nothing in the world could concern her more than laundry. She passed between them without breaking stride. Their boots scraped against stone as they turned away, but their presence had thrown off her timing. The fugitives waiting near the marsh edge couldn't afford delays. Every moment she spent rerouting increased their risk of being caught before they even left the city. Inside the network, everyone was tense. The carpenter, whose name had been written inside the handkerchief, had disappeared from his usual haunts. Traders whispered about interrogations that ended with men being hauled to jails on Broad Street. Some thought the patrols were closing in. Others believed an informant had slipped inside. Hannah didn't know which frightened her more, betrayal or tightening surveillance. She began to rely on coded sounds to replace some of the visual signals. A broom brushed twice against a gate meant wait. 3 taps of a bucket near the pump meant route changed. A sudden whistle near the wharves might redirect someone toward an alternate path through a stable yard. These sounds blended into the fabric of Charleston nights, the clatter of work, the creak of hinges, the murmur of servants, and yet, to those listening for them, they formed a language of escape. One night, standing in the shadows of a narrow lane, she heard the faintest tapping against a fence. 3 taps, then silence. She tapped once in reply and moved forward. A boy, no older than 12, emerged briefly to hand her a folded kerchief. Inside, written in invisible lemon ink, were 2 words that chilled her. They're watching. By now, suspicion had reached the point where patrols sometimes shadowed her silently. She'd catch a glimpse of the same broad-shouldered officer at 2 different points in one day, or hear boots echo behind her, only to fade as she turned a corner. Once, she ducked behind a stable door to let them pass, holding her breath as their lantern light brushed the wood near her cheek. But despite the growing danger, her work didn't stop. One cold night, a family of 3 parents and a teenage girl waited by the marsh boundary near the harbor. They'd traveled through swamps and rice fields to reach Charleston, guided by whispers of a woman who could get them to a ship. Hannah had never met them before, but their eyes told her everything. Exhaustion, fear, and that desperate glimmer of hope she'd seen too many times to count. She led them wordlessly through the streets, their footsteps cushioned by layers of fog. They followed her through a butcher's alley, past shuttered shops, and down to the wharf where Peter waited with his usual stoic calm. He loaded sacks of flour onto a small skiff, hiding them beneath the deck planks. The family crouched in silence. Hannah stood by as if checking laundry bundles, while Peter muttered something about tides to a nearby sailor. No one questioned a woman with a basket. That invisibility was her last remaining weapon. But with every successful crossing, the patrols grew more aggressive. One evening, returning from the docks, Hannah noticed lanterns posted along one of her regular shortcut alleys. A patrolman leaned casually against the wall, pretending disinterest. She turned away before he could meet her gaze, but the message was clear. Her pathways were no longer her own. She started varying her entrances and exits, doubling back unexpectedly, sometimes looping through churchyards to throw off anyone following her. She learned which lanterns had faulty wicks, and used those patches of deeper shadow to slip past unseen. At times, she walked boldly past patrols, trusting that their prejudices made them overlook her. At others, she waited for bells to strike and used the sudden peal to mask the sound of quick footsteps. Her allies adapted alongside her. Traders rotated their stalls more frequently. Dock workers shifted loading times. Even Lottie began altering her sewing patterns to include decoy stitches that led nowhere in case someone intercepted a garment. It was a dance of shadows, growing more intricate with each passing day. The tension reached its peak when a young runner, a boy who usually delivered short notes between market and wharf, failed to appear one night. By morning, whispers spread through the yard. He had been caught carrying a scrap of fabric with a pattern sewn into the hem. No one knew if he had talked, but the silence in the laundry yard was heavy with the possibility. Eyes met briefly and then looked away, each person calculating the odds. Hannah lay awake that night, staring at the wooden ceiling above her cot, listening to the distant sound of bells marking the hours. She understood that every coded sound, every hidden stitch, every glance exchanged in the marketplace was hanging by a thread. The patrols were adapting too. They were learning to listen. She sat up slowly, pulling a thin shawl around her shoulders. There was no choice but to continue. If the network faltered now, countless lives depending on those routes would be trapped. She had to think faster, move quieter, trust deeper, or risk watching the entire system unravel because of a single embroidered letter. Somewhere outside, a bell tolled midnight. Hannah rose to prepare for another run through the tightening streets, where each shadow might conceal a friend or a trap. The morning air was unusually sharp, the kind of chill that crept beneath sleeves and wrapped itself around the bones. Charleston's streets were awake earlier than usual. Patrolmen stood in pairs at corners that once belonged to quiet servants. Lantern posts, newly placed, dotted her favorite alleys. The marketplace murmured under its breath like a throat cleared before a verdict. Hannah sensed it the moment she stepped into the yard. Today was not like the others. She tied her headscarf slowly, deliberately. Her hands did not tremble. She had always known there would be a final day. Whether it ended with her vanishing northward like those she guided, or with her caught under the cold gaze of patrolmen, she could never predict. But she could control how she walked through it. Word had reached her the previous night through the smallest of signals. A baker's wooden spoon turned handle up in its bucket. That meant routes compromised, immediate danger. Normally, such a signal would trigger a pause in movement, a temporary retreat until the heat cooled. But this wasn't a normal night. A group of fugitives, 2 brothers and their elderly mother, had arrived from the inland plantations. They were exhausted, bruised by travel, and hiding in a stable loft not far from the harbor. They couldn't wait another day. The patrols were already sniffing along the roads they'd used to enter the city. If Hannah didn't guide them now, they'd be caught before nightfall. She weighed the choice in silence. To help them would mean walking her routes under heightened scrutiny, with patrols already on alert. To delay would almost certainly mean their capture. Neither option spared her. She lifted the basket onto her hip. The streets were alive with the sound of boots and distant church bells. She walked at her usual pace, Her posture the same as always, eyes down, steps measured, basket pressed against her hip as though it were nothing more than linen and soap. In truth, between layers of cloth lay forged papers, dried bread, and 2 small bundles of herbs meant to disguise scent from tracking dogs. Every detail had been arranged in silence the night before. As she reached the market, she noticed the fishmonger give a subtle shake of his head, an unusual gesture that meant eyes everywhere. She didn't break stride. Instead, she shifted the basket from left to right, signaling that she understood. Her path would need to deviate. She diverted down an alley that ran parallel to Broad Street, passing behind the seamstress's shop. Lottie stood at her window, feigning work. A piece of muslin hung unevenly, pointing left. New route confirmed. Hannah turned the corner just as 2 patrolmen crossed the street she would have taken. Her breath remained even. At the stable loft, the fugitives waited in silence. The brothers' hands were calloused from field work, their eyes darting toward every sound. Their mother, frail but resolute, clutched a shawl around her shoulders. Hannah offered no grand speech, no promises of safety, only a nod. They fell in line behind her, each carrying a piece of cloth to mimic the look of workers aiding with laundry. It wouldn't stand up to close inspection, but it might delay suspicion long enough to slip past. The route that day wound like a thread through the tightening weave of Charleston streets, down side lanes that smelled of boiled sugar, through the courtyard of an abandoned house, past a small chapel where a cracked bell gave away the hour. Patrols were everywhere. She counted them silently. 1 near the cooper's shop, 2 along the harbor road, a mounted officer near the fountain. They were closing the net. Halfway through the route, she caught sight of the same broad-shouldered patrolman who had once leaned close to inspect her basket. This time he wasn't pretending indifference. His gaze followed her openly, his boots echoing as he matched her pace from the opposite side of the street. She turned a corner, quickening slightly, not enough to alarm him, just enough to suggest her work was leading her elsewhere. He followed. At the docks, Peter waited by the skiff, his face unusually tense. He glanced over Hannah's shoulder and then toward the patrolman who was closing the distance. "They're watching," Peter muttered. She didn't respond. There was no time for fear now. She guided the fugitives toward the boat as if delivering laundry to the crew. The brothers lifted sacks. The mother climbed carefully under the deck. Hannah arranged the linens to conceal them, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had done this 100 times. But this time, she could feel the weight of lantern light pressing against her back. The patrolman stopped a few paces away. "Basket," he said flatly. Hannah turned slowly, presenting it with steady hands. He rifled through the linen, finding only fabric. He paused on the forged papers but mistook them for folded napkins. His brow furrowed, not out of evidence but out of suspicion unfulfilled. He stepped closer, scanning her face for a crack, a tremor. He found none. "Busy morning," he said finally. "Yes, sir," she answered softly. "The Alcotts expect their linens before noon." He lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked away, though his lantern light stayed on her long after his footsteps faded. She exhaled silently, gave Peter a single nod, and the skiff slipped into the misty water, oars dipping soundlessly beneath the surface. The fugitives were gone, swallowed by the river and the night beyond it. The return route was the most dangerous. Without the fugitives behind her, suspicion could fall more sharply on her movements. Patrols often doubled back, testing routes for inconsistencies. Hannah took a detour through the churchyard, letting the sound of bells mask her footsteps. She wove between gravestones, through shadows she'd walked 100 times before, until the streets opened again near the laundry yard. The air was colder when she arrived. The yard was quiet, almost eerily so. A boy leaned against a post near the gate, eyes wide with something between awe and fear. "They're talking," he whispered, "about a woman, a basket, someone nearly caught." Hannah set the basket down gently. Her hands, steady through every step of the morning, trembled now for the first time, not from regret, but from the knowledge that the city had seen her more clearly today than ever before. She sat alone for a while after everyone had gone, lantern light flickering against the tubs. She thought of the brothers and their mother slipping into the night. She thought of the invisible web stretching across Charleston, the traders, the dockhands, Lottie's careful stitches. She thought of the handkerchief that had brought patrol eyes closer and how, despite it, the network still moved, still breathed. Tomorrow might bring more searches. It might bring questions she couldn't answer. It might bring silence. But tonight, a family was closer to freedom because she had refused to break her rhythm. Hannah lifted her gaze to the night sky. The stars were faint but steady. The city hadn't caught her yet, and until it did, she would keep walking those same streets, basket in hand, her quiet rebellion stitched into every fold of linen.